courtroom smelled like old wood and floor wax. I remember that clearly. The way the scent hit me when I pushed through the heavy door, the way the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, like they were tired of being on. I sat down at the defendant's table and folded my hands in my lap, and I did not look at my parents. They were sitting 12 feet away from me. 12 feet! I could hear my mother whisper something to their attorney. I couldn't make out the words, but I recognized the tone. I'd been hearing that tone my whole life. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge hadn't come in yet. I looked down at my hands. I should back up. I grew up in a house in eastern Tennessee, in a town small enough that everyone knew your name and your business and your grandmother's maiden name. My father ran a hardware store his own father had built. My mother taught Sunday school and organized the church potluck every third Saturday of the month. They were good people in the way that a lot of people are good, generous to their neighbors, faithful to their routines, proud of the things they built. I was their second child and their only daughter. My brother, who was 4 years older than me, became exactly what my parents imagined. He took over the hardware store, married a woman from the next town over, and had 2 boys they could take fishing. He did everything in the right order and at the right time, and my parents loved him for it in the comfortable, uncomplicated way you love something that does exactly what it was made to do. I was a different kind of problem. I wasn't rebellious. I wasn't difficult. I just wanted something they couldn't picture. From the time I was 16, I wanted to be a firefighter. Not the romantic idea of it. Not the calendar version. I wanted to do the actual work. I'd read every manual I could find. I'd done the physical training on my own, alone, in the backyard before school. I'd gone to an information session at the county fire station at 17, and talked to the captain for 45 minutes about structural burn patterns, and I went home and couldn't sleep from excitement. My father thought it was a phase. My mother said I'd feel differently once I met the right person. I enlisted in the Air Force at 18 into their firefighting specialty, aircraft rescue and firefighting, R5. They didn't come to see me off at the bus station. My mother hugged me in the driveway and cried and said she just wanted me to be safe. My father shook my hand like I was a business acquaintance who'd done something mildly disappointing. I was gone for 8 years. I won't tell you the 8 years were easy, because they weren't, and I won't pretend I didn't miss home sometimes. Not the house exactly, but the idea of a place where someone knew you before you became whoever you were becoming. I was stationed at bases I can't fully describe, deployed to places I still don't talk about at dinner. I pulled people out of burning aircraft. I lost colleagues. I got a commendation I never told my family about because I knew my mother would cry in the wrong way and my father would say something that made it smaller than it was. I called home every few weeks. The calls were short and polite, like conversations between neighbors who are friendly but not close. My mother would tell me about the church potluck. My father would ask if I was eating enough. No one asked what I actually did. No one asked what I was likely. I think they believed I worked in an office somewhere. When I got out at 26, I came home for 3 weeks. My father's hardware store had expanded. He'd brought my brother fully into the business, and together they'd bought the vacant lot next door and added a small garden center. The house had been repainted. My old bedroom was a sewing room. I sat at the kitchen table and drank my mother's coffee and felt like a guest. They asked me what I was going to do now. I told them I'd been accepted to a program, a specialized training pipeline to join a federal wildland fire crew, Hot Shots, the most elite ground-based wildland firefighters in the country. 20-person crews that get flown into the worst fires in the country and work 18-hour shifts on the fire line. My father looked at me over his coffee cup. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "When are you going to do something real?" I drove back to the bus station 2 days early. The property dispute started 2 years after that, when my paternal grandmother passed away. My grandmother, she went by Nana Bess to everyone who knew her, left behind a house on 6 acres at the edge of town. She'd lived there alone since my grandfather died, kept a garden, made preserves, fed every stray cat that came through. She and I had written letters to each other for years, real letters, on paper. She'd asked me, in one of the last ones, whether I would want the house after she was gone. She said she liked the idea of someone who understood hard work and quiet living being in it. I said I would be honored. She left it to me in her will. My father and his brother, my uncle, a man I'll call by what he is, which is a person who has never worked a day without expecting recognition for it, contested the will within a week. Their argument was that my grandmother hadn't been of sound mind in her final years, that she'd been manipulated, that the house should revert to the family estate, which meant to them. I hired an attorney, a young woman from Knoxville who wore sensible shoes and did not waste words. She told me the case was straightforward, but that these things sometimes don't go the way they should, so we needed to be prepared. I told her I was used to that. The hearing was on a Wednesday in March. Cold morning, flat gray sky. I wore my dress uniform, not to make a statement. I want to be honest about that. I wore it because it was the most formal thing I owned, and I wanted to show the court that I was taking the proceedings seriously. That was all. I walked in and my parents were already seated with their attorney, a man in his 50s with silver hair and the particular confidence of someone who has never been told he takes up too much space. He looked at me when I walked in. He didn't recognize me. Why would he? He'd been hired to contest the estate of an elderly woman in a small town. He'd been told the heir was a wayward daughter who'd never amounted to anything. My mother's eyes found mine and then looked away. My father looked at the table. Their attorney leaned over and said something to my mother. She shook her head slightly, and then he looked back at me again, with a brief, dismissive glance, the way you look at something you've already categorized. The bailiff announced the case. The judge came in. She was a woman in her late 50s with short gray hair and reading glasses. She wore low on her nose. She sat down, opened the file, and began to read. The room was quiet except for the fluorescent hum and the occasional sound of someone shifting in a chair. Their attorney presented first. He was smooth. He said my grandmother had been isolated. He said I had a history of being absent from the family. He said, and I remember this clearly because I wrote it down afterward, that I was, quote, a daughter who had never contributed meaningfully to this family or this community, who pursued a series of reckless career choices, and who had no legitimate claim to property that rightfully belongs to the family who built it. My mother didn't flinch. My father nodded slightly, like he was agreeing with something he'd said himself many times before. I looked at my hands again. My attorney responded. She laid out the documentation, the will, the notarized letters, the 2 signed affidavits from my grandmother's physician and her neighbor of 30 years, both attesting to her clear mind and her explicit wishes. She was methodical and precise, and I was grateful for her. Then their attorney did something I hadn't expected. He looked at me and said, addressing the judge, Your Honor, with respect, this young woman has spent the majority of her adult life absent from this family. She has no ties to this community. She couldn't even hold a steady career. The family asks that the court recognize what everyone in this room already knows, that she is, and has always been, the family's greatest disappointment. My mother looked at the floor. I looked at the judge. The judge had stopped writing. She had her pen in her hand, and she was looking at their attorney with an expression that was not quite a frown but was not neutral either. She said, in a voice that was very even, Counsel, I'd like to ask you something. He said, Of course, Your Honor. She said, Are you familiar with the Lassen incident? The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. He said, I'm sorry. She said, The Lassen Fire Complex, Northern California, 3 summers ago. An RF-trained crew working joint operations with a hotshot unit. There was an incident on the Eastern Ridge. 4 firefighters trapped, one of them a crew supervisor. Their escape route had closed. There was a collapse. She paused. Are you familiar with it? He said he was not. She looked at me. She said, I am. My son was the crew supervisor. I had never told anyone in that courtroom what happened on that ridge. I had never told my parents. I had never told my brother. When the commendation came in the mail, I put it in a drawer in my apartment in Boise, and I did not take it out. I wasn't hiding it. I just didn't see the point of saying it. The work was the work. You did it because it needed doing, not because someone was going to call your mother about it. The judge, her name was the Honorable Beverly Crane, and I had not known before that moment that her son was one of the 4, looked at me and said, I recognized your name from the case file. I debated whether to recuse myself. I decided that what I know about this woman's character is not prejudicial. It's evidentiary. She turned back to their attorney. She said, 3 years ago, your client's daughter, this woman here, who you have just described as a disappointment and a woman who has never contributed meaningfully, entered a collapsed structure on an active fire line in conditions your client's attorney clearly cannot imagine. And she pulled 4 people out. One of them was my son. He has 2 daughters of his own now. She set down her pen. She said, I want you to think carefully about the words you chose. Useless. Because I have been sitting here for the last 20 minutes listening to you describe someone I happen to know something about, and I want to tell you on the record in this courtroom that I have never found her to be anything of the sort. The attorney said nothing. My father made a sound that wasn't quite a word. My mother put her hand over her mouth. The judge ruled in my favor. It wasn't even a close decision. The documentation was clear. The will was valid. The claims of diminished capacity were baseless. My attorney had known that going in. It should have been straightforward. But I sat in that courtroom after the gavel came down, and I didn't feel the way I thought I would feel. I thought I'd feel vindicated. I thought I'd feel something clean and final. Instead, I felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hearing. I walked out into the parking lot, and my attorney shook my hand and said I'd done well. I thanked her. She drove away. I stood next to my car for a minute in the cold and looked at the sky. I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, and my father was standing there. His silver hair was thinner than I remembered. He looked older than he had when I'd walked in that morning, which is not a thing that should be able to happen in 3 hours, but somehow it had. He said, I didn't know. I said, I know you didn't. He said, why didn't you tell us? I thought about that for a moment. The real answer was long and involved the sewing room and the handshake at the bus station and the 8 years of phone calls about church potlucks. But standing in a cold parking lot was not the place for that answer. And he was an old man, and he looked like he was carrying something heavy. I said, I didn't think it was what you were asking about. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, the things he said in there, about you being... He stopped. I want you to know I didn't ask him to say it that way. I believed him. That was the strange part. I believed him, and it didn't make it better exactly, but it made it something I could set down. I said, okay, he said. I'd like to... He paused again. Your grandmother wanted you to have that house. I knew that. I've known it for a long time. I think I was angry about it for reasons that didn't have anything to do with you. I looked at him. He said, I think I was angry that she saw something in you that I kept refusing to look at. I didn't have a response to that. Some things don't need a response right away. I just let it sit there in the air between us in the cold. My mother came out through the courthouse door then. She walked across the parking lot with her coat pulled tight around her, and she stopped a few feet away and she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before. Not pride exactly. Something more complicated than pride. Something that looked like grief and love and regret all at the same time. The way those things sometimes arrive together when it's too late to separate them. She said, I'm sorry, sweetheart. 2 words I hadn't heard from her in 30 years. Sweetheart. She used to call me that when I was very small, before I became something she didn't understand. I said, I know, Mom. I meant it. That was the thing I couldn't have explained to anyone from the outside. I meant it, not because everything was okay, or because the years of distance didn't exist, or because the sewing room didn't sting, but because they were my parents, and they were standing in a parking lot in the cold, and they looked like people who had just learned something about their own lives that they hadn't been prepared for, and the only thing I knew how to do, the thing I'd been trained for in 100 different ways, was to not leave someone behind when they were down. I have the house now. I've been working on it on my off rotations. Hot Shots work a rotation schedule, 8 days on and 4 days off during fire season, and the rest of the year is training and prep. I've replaced 2 sections of fencing, and I'm halfway through rebuilding the back porch, which had rotted through in 2 places. There are still fruit trees in the yard. The stray cats still come. My father drove out last month and helped me dig post holes for the new fence section. We didn't talk about the courtroom. We talked about fence posts and soil drainage and the way the ground in this part of Tennessee freezes in a particular way that makes digging harder than it should be. It was a good afternoon. My brother called me last week. We talked for almost an hour. It was the longest conversation we'd had in years. He asked me what it was actually like. The work, the fires, all of it. He asked in the real way, the way where he actually wanted to know. I told him. I told him about the smell of a fire from 2 miles out. The way you can hear it before you see it sometimes. A low roar underneath the wind. I told him about the way a crew moves together when everything is working. 18 people in one mind almost. Everyone knowing their job and trusting the person next to them. I told him about the ridge in California, and I told him the parts I could put into words, which is not all of it, but it's enough to give someone the shape of the thing. He was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then he said, "I wish I'd asked you sooner." I said, "You're asking now." That's the thing about time. It moves in one direction, and you can't recover what you spent of it, but you can decide what you do with what's left. My grandmother understood that. She wrote it to me once in a letter, in her careful cursive, in ink that had started to fade by the time she sent it. The people worth keeping are the ones you can still build something with. Even late. I put that letter in a frame. It's on the mantel above the fireplace in her house. In my house, I'm still learning to call it that. I've thought a lot about what my father said in that parking lot. Not the apology part, though that mattered. I mean the part where he said he'd been angry that my grandmother saw something in me he kept refusing to look at. That sentence has stayed with me longer than anything the attorney said inside the courtroom, because that's the thing about refusing to look at something. It doesn't make it smaller. It just means you're the last one to understand it. My grandmother, Nana Bess, was not a complicated woman in the way people use that word now, meaning difficult or hard to read. She was straightforward. She kept a garden. She fed stray cats. She wrote letters by hand, but she paid attention in a way that most people don't. The kind of attention that costs you something, because it means you have to actually see what's in front of you instead of what you expected to find. She saw what I was trying to build when I was 17 years old and talking about fire behavior and rescue rotations, and she never once told me it was a phase. That kind of attention is its own form of integrity. You can't fake it and you can't shortcut it. Either you're willing to look honestly at the people in your life, or you're not. I wasn't angry at my parents for a long time, and then I was, and then I wasn't again. That's not a spiritual arc. It's just what happens when enough time passes and you get tired of carrying weight that was never really yours to begin with. The distance between us wasn't created in a single moment. It was built slowly, the way most damage is, in small choices repeated over years. The handshake at the bus station, the phone calls that never went past the surface, the bedroom turned into a sewing room. None of those things were malicious. They were just the result of two people who had a picture of who their daughter was supposed to be and who kept choosing that picture over the actual person standing in front of them. What I know now is that people generally become who they were practicing to be. My parents practiced not looking for a long time, and so when the moment came in that courtroom, they genuinely didn't know what they were looking at. That's not a judgment. That's just how it works. What you practice, you become good at, including blindness. And I practiced something too. I practiced doing the work without needing the recognition. I practiced showing up on the fire line when it was dark and the air was thick with smoke and nobody outside that crew would ever know what happened on that ridge. I didn't practice that because I was noble. I practiced it because it was the only version of the job that felt honest to me. You don't pull someone out of a burning structure because you want your parents to hear about it. You do it because they're in there and you have the training and the time is now. The judge, the Honorable Beverly Crane, did something in that courtroom I hadn't asked for and couldn't have planned. She told the truth about something she had witnessed because she was a person who paid attention and had the authority to say what she saw. That's all. She wasn't rescuing me. She was just refusing to let a false version of events go unchallenged. I think that's worth something. I think the willingness to say out loud what is actually true, even in a room where the false version is more convenient, that's a kind of courage that doesn't require a fire line or a uniform. It just requires the decision to not stay quiet when quiet would cost someone something real. My father dug fence post holes with me last month. We didn't talk about any of this. We talked about soil drainage. It was a good afternoon. I think that's what building something late actually looks like. Not a big conversation, not a formal reconciliation. Just two people choosing, on a cold afternoon, to show up and do a useful thing together. My grandmother would have understood that. She always said you could tell more about a person from how they worked beside you than from anything they ever said. She was right about that. She was right about a lot of things.